How's everybody doing? Did you sleep well? Coffee? Got some good coffee? I did not sleep well, and I had some coffee this morning as well. So my name's Joe Chilcote. I work for Meta on the client platform engineering team. We manage tens of thousands of Macs in our environment using a lot of open source tools as well as some vendor stuff as well. And I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a different approach with this talk because we're all used to interacting with our MDMs through the console, through the GUI, and sending commands down to our clients, right? But we don't really know what's happening when you do that, when you click that button. So I kind of wanted to take a look at MDM from the other side, from the client side, back up to the server, because I think it's pretty instructive to have an understanding for what's going on in the background there, because then you can make better decisions about your clients. You can provide better feedback to Apple and your MDM vendor if you understand better about what is expected and compare that against what you're observing on your clients. And the big caveat is I'm only going to be talking about, I guess, what Apple calls legacy MDM here. I'm not going to talk about any of the Sonoma stuff, and I'm not going to mention DDM or device management or declarative management. Point it in. How's that?
It's the volume on the headset.
Is the volume controlled up there? Okay. I'll try to talk louder, maybe. So there are other sessions here this week. There's a declarative management session, I think, later today, right? So I'm not going to delve into that stuff, although it's very exciting. And specifically for some of the topics I'm going to go over today, DDM is going to make our lives a lot better, I think. And also, I still think this is important because MDM is going to be around for a while. DDM is still kind of new. They're adding features. MDMs are going to take a while to integrate the stuff into their product. And we might all have clients out there that don't support Sonoma. And so, there's going to be a year or two while we're still supporting this stuff. So not quite, running into a wall here with the old MDM stuff. So what is MDM? Kanji has a really nice article here about kind of explaining Apple's philosophy with their MDM protocol. They've created a very specific protocol and set of commands that you can look up and research. And the MDM vendors have all taken this protocol from Apple and built their own apps around it, built their own Chrome, integrating it with other services, creating local agents that might run and interact with the MDM in a way that they see is the best way to support their end users or their customers. MDM is not kind of a wholesale device management solution. So that's where the vendors come in, right? They take what Apple has written and provided, and they build around it to provide that service, the extra service to their customers. Apple documents the MDM protocol pretty thoroughly on their developer site. And again, it's on the developer site, so it's kind of tailored towards MDM vendors. But those of us in the community, us admins, can gain a lot of insight by looking at these logs or looking at these documentation. They also provide what the expected responses are going to be from clients. And that is really useful because you can look at what sort of things your MDM is sending to your devices, and then you can kind of try to determine what the response from the clients would be. You can compare that against your observed what you observe happening on your fleet, and then that can go a long way to helping you troubleshoot issues. One of the nice things is they add in the information about when a command was first added to the OS. So in this example, recovery lock was added in 11.5, which is interesting because I don't think that was even a spring release, right? That was probably a little bit later in the year. So that shows that Apple is continuously developing the stuff. They're adding features. They may announce stuff at WWDC, and then it doesn't get added until later in the year. And so this is useful to look up and see whether the command is relevant to the machines that you have in your fleet. You might look out and say, oh, well, we're still on the version before 11.5. Maybe we're still on Catalina. And so this command won't be relevant for our clients. And the MDM vendors themselves will probably maybe gray out this option for those clients that it doesn't apply to. Apple also ships a schema in their GitHub account. It's a collection of YAML files, some structured data that you can look through, read, but more importantly, you can build automations if you want to pull that data in, do some manipulation on it, and then that can give you good information about the sorts of things that you can do in your fleet. And again, they add the introduced key there, or value, so that you can, if you have some sort of automation, you can query it and say, will this work on our clients? And this is great for determining if your MDM is even going to be able to support some of these commands on your clients as well. So what do MDM commands do? They're just simple instructions. They're little p-lists that get configured and sent down to the clients. They do things like installing packages, sending down device locks or remote wipes, things like that. You can enable remote desktop with these things now. Software update is a big part of the MDM command schema. And also, it can retrieve information from the clients. So in a similar way of like a Jamf extension attribute or something that runs routinely on the clients and sends data back to the MDM, there are commands that you can send that will send back specific information about the models, about the OS, whether it's Apple Silicon, that sort of thing. And the commands can also include other payloads like certificates, configuration profiles, that sort of thing. And again, each MDM vendor is going to expose and utilize these commands in their own way, and they'll build their own Chrome around it, integrate it with their other products. They might have a root agent that runs on the clients that also is gathering data and sending it back for the MDM to make better decisions. But each of them customizes it in their own way that they see fit as a value add for their customers. And for this talk, I reached out to some friends who manage devices with different MDMs, because I wanted to see what the interfaces looked like and to kind of compare them. And then later on, we'll come back to this and try to determine what exactly is happening on the clients when the stuff is sent. So in this example, Jump Cloud has an option, a drop-down option, and you can select from available updates that the client sees. And I note here that it says available updates, plural, so I'm kind of guessing that maybe it would show more than one, and you might have a choice. So if you say, my fleet is not ready for 13.4.1, I only want 13.4, it should be possible for an MDM to target that specific version even though there's a newer one available. So that would be pretty interesting to see. Kanji has a pretty good interface here, and they add a lot of their own customization. And they give really good information here to the user or to the admin explaining the options. So you can set a deadline, which is kind of interesting because deadlines are not currently in the current MDM spec, not part of MDM. But it's unclear here which command is going to be sent. So it kind of implies that maybe they're trying to abstract that away from the admin and kind of take care of those details in the background for you as part of their service. Workspace ONE has a pretty Spartan interface here, but they give you a drop-down with choices for the different commands that you want to run. And they do put the version number in here, but it's hard-coded, so maybe they determine which version the Mac sees as the latest available, and then they hard-code that into here. So perhaps maybe not quite as flexible as some of the other ones where you can't choose maybe one of the older versions. And what was that?
That's after you hit the OS you want
Okay, sure. Oh, okay, so the previous screen you can choose down. Okay, thank you. And interesting here is that it's for the beta, and it does recognize that it's beta 3, but it doesn't list out the version or the product key or the build version. So that'll be interesting because, what happens if you tell a beta that's on 14.0 that I want you to install 14.0, right? So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. Simple MDM has a nice interface too. One thing that I thought was interesting here in the screenshot is you can choose the relative major OS. So the implication there is maybe your fleet wasn't ready for Ventura for some reason, but you still want to make sure that they're updated to the relative minor release of last year's OS. So each of these vendors, as you can see, kind of approaches it in a slightly different way. And again, that was a good point that it's probably more of a wizard setup. So the options might be there and then not there on the next pane as you go through. So each vendor builds in their own interface because that's what they are using to make our jobs easier, right? And they may be adding in their own customizations, using a reagent, pulling in data from inventory, things like that, that help them make better decisions and help make our jobs easier. But the underlying commands are all the same, right? So once again, I think it's really good for us to understand what is happening at the atomic level on our machines, because then we can go back to our vendors and back to Apple and say, maybe this process could be improved for our work, our use case. Here are some bugs that we've run into and that sort of thing. But before we get to looking at the responses and the logs, we need to talk about what commands look like. Again, they're little P lists, very simple, nothing too complex. And I mean, this is basically what your vendor sends down for the device information command, right? The format is simple here. All it needs is a request type. And there are other request types in there that can also feed back information from the clients, like security info, which brings back stuff like is SIP enabled and stuff like that. That can be really useful for your security teams for verifying the health of the clients. And another thing to point out here is the command UUID. It's a unique identifier for each of the commands that gets sent. And this can be used by your MDM to kind of track over time the interactions between the clients and the server. So for instance, before Ventura was released, the software update commands did not, when you sent a list for, when you sent the command to ask for a list back for software update commands, sometimes it would return incomplete information, and so you needed to do a scan first. But I believe with the newer install frameworks, you can just send the available update command down, and it'll return back a full list of what it sees. It kind of does that scan inside on its own. But then the vendor, the MDM, can take that information back, tie it to this command UUID, this unique identifier, and then later on, when you're ready to send the command to install an update, it can query this in its database and say, oh, okay, this was the command that we got back, or this was the response we got back for this command where we asked the client what updates are available to it, and this is the list that it gave us. So then it can say, okay, let's choose the latest one or whichever one the admin wants to push down. Does the client think it's available? Yes, good. We're good to go. We can send down the next command. The response you get is also in a plist format, and it will depend on the commands that you send, but the responses are also documented on Apple's developer site and through the schema. So you can go through that and kind of have a predetermined idea of what you expect to come back, or what the MDM would expect to come back from the clients. And for example, with the device information command, it gives you all kinds of stuff, right? This is a very short, truncated list, but you can get like the model ID, the OS version. It'll tell you whether it's Apple Silicon, which is really useful, and all sorts of other stuff. In fact, Apple documents all of those responses on their developer site. And this is, again, a truncated screenshot, because if I put the entire screenshot on there, we wouldn't be able to see anything, right? But this is good to know because this information is coming through MDM. So it's coming through Apple's trusted connection to your clients. So it adds a little bit of more veracity to the information that you're getting from the clients. And also, if you feel like there should be more things added, this is a great way to look up and see whether your idea has been thought of before, and if not, submit feedback to Apple and say, hey, here's another piece of information from our clients I think would be wonderful to get back from device information or the security info command. Errors can also be useful in the responses. When you send a command, you might, the MDM is doing it automatically, but if you're playing around with this and testing, you might make a mistake in typing out the plist. You may send down malformed information. There might be a network error when it receives the command and then something else happens. It's trying to get the certificate or something. And so you can get useful error information back from the clients as well. It includes a little string of the error itself. In this one, it crashed processing the install profile command. It also gives you an error code there that you can include with your feedback to Apple if you think that this error is unexpected. But how do you know what a command is supposed to look like, right? We know that it's a plist, but there was that request type, and you can look up in the documentation and see the different things that need to be added. But under the Nano MDM, the open source MDM repo, my coworker and friend Jesse Peterson has a project called commander.py, and it's just a simple little script that will kind of mock up what commands will look like for you. And it's kind of fun to go through that and just throw, it'll list out all of the available options that he's written into that command or that the community has added. And you can throw different different arguments at this or different commands at it, and it'll spit out what the plist is supposed to look like. And that can be pretty interesting because some commands are much more complex than others. The device info command, and this is exactly how I pulled up that slide from earlier, just ran it through Jesse's tool. But the device info command is very simple. It's just a request type of device information. The client sees that, it says, cool, I'm going to send you back this list of information. But these commands can get a little bit more complex. The device lock command, of course, you have to include a PIN with it, right? So that your help desk can give that to the user when they realize that they left their computer in the trunk and it wasn't stolen after all. And for other things like your erase device, you can, in the old days, you could also add a PIN to that as well. And the more complex a command can get, the more keys and values you'll need to add. For scheduling an update command, you need to add the install action key in there as well. And there's a bunch of different types of install actions, and those might themselves have additional parameters that you can add to it as well. And there are other keys that are considered optional from Apple, and there are keys that are considered required. And that's all listed in the documentation too. So for updates, there are optional keys for things like adding a priority, that you want it to be a high priority for your clients to install something, or also adding the deferrals. You can give users the option to click, I'm busy, not now, let's try again tomorrow. And they give you the option of adding that or not adding it for some of these commands. Speaking of software update, this is why we're all here this week, right? A lot of software update sessions. And And that's kind of the main example, the main example that I want to get into with looking into the commands, because it's a pretty rich environment, a lot of options, and so many things you can trip over as well. So it makes for a good talk, and that's why we're here today, right? And again, I'm only talking about the MDM as it currently stands, legacy MDM, I'm going to call it. I don't know if has it been deprecated yet? We don't know. DDM is the future. Sounds awesome, especially the software update stuff. I'm very excited to get through this week and start testing that. And when Sonoma comes out, it should be fun to see that in action. And a lot of those, a lot of the ideas that Apple is coming up with has been from conversations with all of you, right? Through feedbacks, use cases, and things like that. So again, kind of having a basic understanding about how things are working under the seams allows you to be a better feedback giver. And then that allows Apple to maybe rethink some of the things and provide a better product for us, and it becomes this virtuous cycle that makes everybody happy. There are several ways to interact with devices to schedule an OS update. You can send down a scan, and again, I'm pretty sure that this is redundant nowadays after Ventura, I think, but it can't hurt, right? But you send a scan, the machine, it's kind of similar to if you're on a Mac and you open up system prep or system settings, you go to the general software update tab, and then you see it kind of spinning, and it does a thing, and then it shows either you have updates available or not. It's doing a scan there, right? So I think that's pretty much what you're telling the client to do in the background. Available OS updates is a way to ask the client what it thinks is available to itself. And one thing that I was reminded for in Tom's session yesterday is that the MDM protocol commands don't care about the deferrals that you've set. So if you are deferring 13.4.1 on your clients for a week or so to make sure there aren't any issues, and you send this available OS update command to one of those clients, they will go ahead and tell you that they see that update as available to them. Now, the GUI won't show it. The user won't be able to see it because we're deferring it, right? But this is a way for the MDM to, we don't want to be lying to the MDM, right, from our clients. So, and in that way, as an admin, you can make a final decision, and perhaps maybe there's a 0 day that was patched, and you have a 7-day deferral, but you think, oh, maybe we should actually send this out after day 2. You can use MDM to actually push that update down to the clients and kick off the install, even though the user can't see it in the GUI, which is pretty nice. OS update status there, the last one, is a way for the server to just query the client and say, hey, a while ago, we told you to kick off some action, some install action. Let us know how it's going. And it'll reply back with things like, I'm downloading still, come back later. Or it'll reply back with maybe, hey, I don't really know what you're talking about. Something happened and I wasn't expecting it, so I kind of gave up on that thing. So the MDM vendor, the console, can get that information back and evaluate it and make further decisions. Like maybe this client needs to be sent another scan to try to rescan for updates. Maybe the last time we tried to tell it to update, at some later time, and now we're asking it what the status is, and it's replying back with some information saying it has no idea what we're talking about. So let's go ahead and send down a command to try to do the install like right now. The schedule OS update is the one that you'll interact with the most within your MDM console. These are the commands that say install now, install later, which version you want to install, whether you want to include additional deferrals that the user can click not now, try again tomorrow, that sort of thing. And the available options within the schedule OS update include things like downloading the update only and doing nothing else. And this can be useful for just adding, taking care of the download now knowing that you're going to be sending another command later to process the update, that'll save them time later on when they get that command, because it'll already be downloaded and maybe even prepared, and they'll immediately get that pop-up that says, hey, the admin wants you to apply an update. You should be good to go because it's all downloaded, and when they're ready, they can click restart. Notify only is just takes that one step further. It downloads the update, caches it, and then it pops up a notification center notification that says, hey, just want to let you know there's an update available. We're not telling you what to do. You're your own person, but there's a big, juicy restart button here if you want to click it. But you can defer this to later if you want, and we won't bother you anymore. Install later becomes a little bit more aggressive there. It'll pop up and say, hey, the admin thinks that you really should update this to this version. But we're going to be nice, and we're going to give you a couple of options here. You can either tell the machine to try it overnight while you're asleep. You can say, no, I'm too busy right now. I'm working on my PSU talk, and I can't do an update right now because I don't want Keynote to break. And then remind me tomorrow. Or you can click update now if you're ready to go. And then, of course, there are other interactions that you can do, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. Install ASAP is pretty much what it means. It says, we want this update to apply right now, and we think that you, the user, should apply it as well, and so we're going to do pretty much everything we can to convince you of that. But if you have some open documents that have unsaved data, or if you're pretty quick with the mouse and you want to dismiss this notification before the 60 seconds are up, we'll give you a reprieve for now, right? And then the force restarts, the ban hammer. It doesn't care if they have documents open. It doesn't care if they, close the notification, close the lid. I mean, I suppose they could force shut down their machine at that point, and then maybe see what happens when it boots back up. Our users are good at coming up with alternatives, right? But this is kind of a escalating collection of commands that the MDM can send, and also send, as in concert with each other. You can say download now, and then maybe a day later you do a notify only, which will just give them a nice notification that says, there's an update available, and then maybe move on to install ASAP after those early adopters and most of your clients get updated. And then if you have a deadline, when the deadline hits, you could hit them with the force download or the force install, force restart, which is even more fun. They still get the 60 seconds. They just can't do anything about it. It's a countdown to restart. So again, I returned to Jesse's commander.py. I misspelled it there. And asked it to tell me what software update commands would look like. And I just listed out the help menu here. And so again, you can provide a version key, or a version. The version is the marketing version, the 13.0, 14.0, 13.4.1, that sort of thing. And the product key is a little bit more ambiguous. It's kind of based on the build number, but you can see it has some other stuff in here too, the MSU update, the patch, all that stuff. And so that can be a little bit hard to determine, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And then it has the deferrals and priority as well that you can add into the command as optional parameters. The priority, I've played around with it. I actually have no idea what it does, because I send it with low and it does the thing, and I send it in high with high and it does the thing. So I'm guessing maybe there's something else in there that might, on the client itself, it might be in a state where it's less inclined to react to MDM commands, and maybe if you send it with a high, it'll override those objections and go ahead and do it. And the other interesting thing here is, again, if you have a beta on 14.0 and you want to update it to beta 3, what happens when you send a command that says, hey, I want you to update to 14.0? The client might think you're crazy. It might respond with, dude, I'm already on 14.0, go away. Also with the RSRs, the rapid security responses, they don't change the version number. They add the little parentheses because they hate us, but only the build number itself changes. And so as a result, these product keys change as well, and we'll include that build number in there. And each of them will be different for each beta. So it's important to remember that. And for the MDM vendors, it's important for them to support that because we want our users to be testing betas. And we also realize that people hate updating, and betas update pretty often. And so a lot of times I'll look out and look at the versions that our testers are on, and more times than not, a large percentage of them are still on beta 1, right? Because they wanted to test something new, they got the update, and then they kind of lost the train, they got busy, they're doing their day job, or maybe they forgot to go back and re-sign in with their Apple ID because, again, they hate us. But it's important for the MDM vendors to be build number aware, is what I'm getting at here. And how can you determine this product key? This is an example of sending an available OS updates command down and then getting the response back from the client. It'll tell you the version that it's on. It'll tell you the build number that it's on. And it'll also tell you the available updates that it sees, right? So this one sees 13.4.1, but it also provides that product key in that response to the MDM. So at that point, because the MDM, of course, knows who it's talking to, it knows that your machine can see this update. If it chooses, it can use the product key itself to send the command down to do the install instead of just the base OS version. Apple also has a kind of an API of sorts with a very peculiar name, the GDMF. I assume it stands for Gosh Darn Management Framework. But this is kind of a official, unofficial, who knows. It's an API that MDMs can use to query, and it's updated when new versions are released. And it has some hardware-specific information that the MDM can use to predetermine what versions should be available for the fleet. So the MDM can kind of take a shortcut and not have to go out and ask all your tens of thousands of machines what version they all independently think are available to them. It can go look up in this API and say, this is this model type, what updates should be available to that model type, right? And then it can go ahead and just send down the commands to process the installs. So it's also important to understand what sort of responses that the MDM can get from the clients. Usually, if everything is healthy and good, you'll get the acknowledgement. You'll get an ACK from the client, which basically just means, hello, I received your request. I'm good to go. We'll take care of it. Just letting you know that I got your call. It could return an error, like we mentioned earlier, if something happened in transit, some sort of network problem. If maybe the keys changed between versions, maybe something got deprecated and we're still sending it, that sort of thing. The command format error, a specific type of MDM protocol error that it can respond with. And these are things that are important to the developers at your MDM. But if you do see that these are happening a lot on your fleet, that gives you a good reason to open up a ticket with them and ask what's going on there. The last two are the most interesting. The idle basically, I believe means, hi, nice to meet you, but I don't really have anything to do right now because you're asking me something and it's either already done or it doesn't apply to me. Or if a push notification goes out and there are no commands queued up by the MDM, it'll just say, cool, just checking in. I'll sit here idly waiting for something else to happen. And I believe Macs do check in when you boot up for the first time after a reboot. And there's probably some sort of recurring check-in that happens as well. I don't think that's documented anywhere, but the clients should check in on their own occasionally. And so quite often you'll see a whole bunch of idles coming from some of these clients. Not now is a little bit more interesting. It's saying that it can't execute the command for some reason. An example of this is, I believe before Ventura, all the software update commands did not support power nap when the lid is closed. So when your users go home for the night, they close their laptop, if that command gets queued and the MDM power nap process wakes up and it checks in with MDM and it gets an instruction to perform some update command, including things like scan or just tell you what's available, it'll respond with a not now, which basically means I've got your request, I can't do it right now, but we'll talk again later, right, when I'm in a better state. In Ventura, I believe they added the support for power nap lid closed mode for all of the software update commands. So even installing an update theoretically should work when the lid is closed overnight when they're fast asleep. So how do you go about determining what the responses from your clients are, right? The MDM itself knows what these responses are because it's been asking the questions and it's getting those responses back. And again, it has that unique identifier that it can associate with the questions that it asked. But you as the admin may not have access to that. Some MDMs might give you like a debug mode that you can log into. Some might show like a table view showing the responses, which can be helpful. Or maybe you're logging all of the webhooks up to Splunk or something, and you're creating your own dashboards and looking at the trends in that way so that you can make better decisions. Or if you're using one of the open source MDMs, you might have direct access to the server, so you can just tail the syslog and that sort of thing. But luckily, you have a fleet of devices that are more than happy to collect information on your behalf, right? Through the unified logging. Looking into just like the MDM client process, as well as other things like the software update processes and that sort of thing, this can give you a lot of rich information about how your clients are reacting to the commands that your MDM is sending. But how do you know which logs to go looking for? It turns out about 6 years ago, I stood up here and gave a talk, a very tedious talk about unified logs. They were new at the time. I think it was Sierra. I've completely forgotten everything from that research that I did for that. And I actually considered watching this for today, but I couldn't do it. I just don't like the sound of my own voice. So what I did instead is I read another very informative article on Kanji's site written by Mike Boylan that really lays out very clearly Apple's intentions with unified log and gives a lot of really useful information about how you can interact with the unified log database itself. And suffice it to say, Apple set out to make unified logging as efficient as possible while still collecting as much data as they can, and also building in privacy from the start. There are ways that you can get more detailed information that would include things like if you're troubleshooting network connections and stuff, it'll include things like the IP address and whatnot. But a lot of times you'll see like private data just kind of blocked out in there, which is good because we don't want any of the malwares to be grabbing the stuff and shipping it. But for the purposes of this talk, I just want to go over a few kind of basic hints with the unified log and the log command line tool that I found useful in my investigations. The first thing you'll want to know is the main options for the log command. And the man page is actually really good for the log command. It's worth reading through. You can stream the logs, which is just kind of a straight stream of consciousness from your computer. It's like, if Jack Kerouac was an AI. And it's a bit much. If you just run log stream on your machine, it just starts spitting out everything, right? Log show is the same thing, but it kind of pulls in stuff from the past. So you can say, I just wanted to look at the logs from the last hour, and I don't want to continue getting the real-time logging as well. Log collect is an interesting one and super useful for our work because you can use this to create a log archive file that you can later consult and maybe compare against what's happening currently. Maybe you're trying to reproduce a problem, and once it happens, you might run log collect and create an archive at that point in time so that later you can return to it. And that's good too because these logs kind of go away after a while. And I'm not sure what the rules are for that, but some logs are a little bit more chatty than others, and so I think there must be some sort of threshold that it reaches where it starts flushing the old logs. So it could be useful to run this every once in a while, give it a timestamp that you can return to later when you need to do more investigation. And then you can run the log show against that archive to query it, and it'll give you the same interface as if you're looking at your own machine. And these can be passed back and forth. You can ask your users to run this command, create the log archive, and give it to you as well. And Apple even gives us an easy way to create a log archive through the sysdiagnose. So you can ask your users to just run sysdiagnose, upload the zip file, and within that there's a .log archive file, which probably is going to be the biggest thing in there as well. It'll be a couple hundred megs, probably at least. And this is, a lot of times, this is why Apple also asks you for a screenshot of a problem that's happening, and they want that timestamp in the menu. Because I think they use that, and they look at what time the thing happened, and then they can go and look in the logs around that time period and look for interesting events where that problem occurred. So to jump in a little bit deeper here, log stream, by default, I think it does show all the info stuff. I don't know if that's redundant or not, but I've just gotten used to always typing in info and debug in there. The log show command, you can also format the output. By default, it's very busy. There's a lot of columns. Not all of them are really useful for us humans. They might be more meant for ingesting it into some aggregator and crunching through the information. I like the style compact myself because it kind of takes out some of the extraneous stuff, gives you a nice cleaner log line that you can look through. It's a little easier on the eyes. Sometimes you have to expand these windows out super far because it's a lot of information that comes through. Syslog will be familiar to people who are used to like the old ASL and syslog style logging. And then JSON is very useful because it's structured data. You can pipe that into some other process to do manipulation on there. And it includes all of the keys. There's more. You don't even see everything in the output. There's all kinds of stuff in there as well. And that last one is interesting. I would have thought that error would be one of the top level arguments, but it's not, like debug. But you can query based on the log type. And this predicate is what I want to get into next because I feel like it's the most useful piece of running the log command. It gives you the most ability to filter down the things that you're looking for. You can filter on the process, which is the program that's running, the subsystem, which is often written out as that kind of reverse DNS style com.apple.softwareupdate wording. And most apps will use that metaphor as well, but they don't have to. The subsystem can be whatever the app developer decides it wants it to be. Category is just a further way of narrowing down searches within the subsystem. And again, it's optional. Some developers add them like tag words so that they can, in their development, they can go back and look. And then event message is, of course, the text string that gets returned from the log itself. There's other filters that can be, or other predicates that can be useful. Again, the log type We saw that earlier with looking at the error. You could look for fault log types and that sort of thing. The process image path and sender image path are kind of similar. The process image path is just the full path to that process that was running. And then the sender image path is whatever framework or system system extension or something that is the caller for the originator of the event that's being shown. So just to give a little glance at what a log looks like, and this is truncated down. I took out a big piece of the timestamp, but the process is right there at the beginning. It's usually at the very beginning. Sometimes it's not there. Sometimes you'll see like a thread ID or something. But usually for the stuff that we're looking up, you'll see a process ID there. And then the subsystem is right there within the brackets and combined with a category. And again, the categories can be optional. Not every developer is adding those, but they can be useful for further narrowing down your searches. And then, of course, the event message, the actual reason that log event exists. And real quick, you can also tell it what time span you want to search for. So if you just run log show, even if you're looking for a specific process, it's going to give you all kinds of stuff from like a month ago, right? So you might say, I only want to look for the last 7 days, the last 1 hour. I think it does minutes too. You can say like the last 15 minutes, that sort of thing. And so that's useful if you're like iterating through something and you're trying to look at the logs that happened only when you did a thing like a minute ago. You can say, just show me the last 5 minutes and that sort of thing. You can give it a start and an end. So if you did have one of those screenshots from your user that showed the time, you could say, okay, let's start 5 minutes before that and end 5 minutes after that and see what was going on when they got that error. So throw a couple of examples up. This one is useful for looking up the TCC permission stuff. So when the TCC things were new and we weren't all sharing the information to put into the PPPC profiles, this was a good way to look and try to figure out what's going on. You get some sort of pop-up that says, hey, terminal wants to access your desktop. You don't know what that is. So you could look in the log and look for this attribution chain. Look for logs beginning with attribution chain, and that way it just shows you a very limited subset of the logs that are in the system. And then you can take that information, go look at the cert signing for that app, and then that'll help you craft up your PPPC profiles. That's a very simple example. For a more complex example here, and I'll just leave this up for a minute because I know Jason's taking notes by hand. This one kind of broke me. We were trying to figure out why AnyConnect was constantly restarting or reconnecting on a percentage of our clients, and we needed to try and track down some of the specific events that were happening when they were seeing that reconnect happen, because it was kicking them off of VCs. Some web-based interactions would time out and they would have to reload and things like that. And so it looks really gnarly there, but if you break it down, it's actually kind of simple. We needed to look for AnyConnect and the new Cisco Secure Client, because we were testing that as well to see if it fixed the problem, which it eventually did. And then some of the categories in these logs were very chatty, just generating a ton of data. And so we just looked for the things that had the sorts of events that we were interested in, and we said we only want to receive information about these things. And then, of course, the rest of it is just a bunch of ors, right? It's like, has this phrase, or this phrase, or this phrase. And this was kind of curated over time as we found new interesting events that we wanted to pull in. And I kind of didn't really clean up the ones that weren't as interesting. So it just kind of became this monster by the end. But it really helped because we were able to provide this feedback both to Apple and Cisco. They were able to identify what exactly the bugs were, and Cisco was able to come back and say, oh, you know what, this actually is something that we've been tracking over here. It's fixed in this version. We were able to push out that version to our clients, and then because we were collecting these logs, we could graph out and see those errors just drop, which was really nice. And so I want to talk a little bit more about some investigations that I did. So this will be a journey through the fever swamp that is my brain. But again, with all this information available on the clients, I wanted to take a look at it and look for trends, look for anything that spikes here or there with software update. And I was testing the MDM software update commands, and I wanted to give good feedback to Apple. Hopefully I gave good feedback to Apple. And so I wanted to be able to be as thorough as possible in testing this stuff. So I knew, where do I start, right? There's a software update process, software update D. I could throw that in, and I thought, cool, that's the process name. Clearly, that will give me everything I need to know about what's happening on these clients. But it turns out it was just way too much. And a lot of it is redundant. The scans happen occasionally. A lot of it is, again, information that might be only interesting to the developer, right? So they want all this information back while they're doing the development of this stuff. And some of it is just gobbledygook, like base 64 encoded stuff that doesn't really have any meaning for me as a human reading it. But I remembered that you could style it as JSON, which again, structured data, easy to work with. You can pipe it somewhere and interact with that data and kind of pull out the pieces that you think is interesting. And so I threw that into the process, and it gives, this is again a truncated subset of that was actually the error that was in there. This is a subset of everything that's shown. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that, again, may not be as interesting for us. But the things that popped out to me were subsystem category, right? So it turns out that the process can refer or interact with multiple subsystems, and vice versa. A subsystem can interact with multiple processes. So you start to get this web of interactivity happening on the system, and then you can go and build the relationships and try to find information that is most useful to what you're trying to investigate. So I threw together a very ugly little Python script, and I put it up in my GitHub called log report that takes that JSON from the output of the log command, manipulates it a little bit, and spits out the information back to you about what you're asking for. So I asked it, give me all the subsystems for the software update D command. And I thought, surely this would be a pretty manageable list of subsystems, but it turns out there's a whole lot. Now, some of them, kind of jump out as not being super interesting, but some really looked curious, and I wanted to delve into those more. So I took one of those, say, I think it's the software update Mac controller, threw that back into this log report thing and said, list me out all the categories that it found that within the log search that I just did. And again, it's a reasonable number of categories, and these are optional. The developers don't have to add categories. It's kind of a useful thing to narrow down your searches, but it's not something that they're expected to do. After going a few rounds of this and looking through specific processes, subsystems, categories, filtering down the logs to a manageable quantity, I started to get a better idea of the sorts of things I was looking for. And when you read through these logs long enough, you start losing your mind a little bit, but you also start seeing patterns. And so I started noticing things like phrases like sending event. There's other things like processing server event, I think, for MDM stuff. There's MDM requested is an interesting one. But I also started seeing this OTA a lot. In talking to Apple, they said, oh yeah, that's a good one to look for because it has lots of good information. And OTA stands for over-the-air updates. It's the style of updates that came over from iOS back in Big Sur, I think. And so it turns out there's some meaningful information that you can get through these OTA logs. Again, truncated. I cut down what all is shown here, but each of these OTA available logs corresponds, I believe, with a scan. So if you send an update scan, it'll do this, but then they happen constantly in the background. So those 30,000 log lines, I would think maybe 1,000 of those probably at least were these scans. And they return the same data every time. It'll say, hey, I found an update available, 13.3.1 in this case. No, I'm on 13.3.1 and I found 13.4.1 as available. And it'll list a whole bunch of stuff out in there, including interesting things like whether it was initiated by the command line or the user. I think user's a little fuzzy because I think the background scans also are considered user because it's happening on the client. MDM equals false is kind of cool. So now I know that this was not initiated by an MDM scan. Install tonight is true, so maybe this machine has those buttons checked for automatically keep my Mac updated, and when it does a scan, it tags it as if you have an update available, you should try to install it tonight. And it has the target OS version as well with the build in there. And this is what it looked like when the MDM was true. And interestingly, the install tonight was false. So maybe this was just a command asking for a scan or the available updates, which did a scan. And we're not actually telling the client that we want it to install. There are other OTA-related phrases that you can look for. The available, again, is when it scans. Download is when it triggers a download of the update. And it'll give you like a percentage in there as well. So it's kind of useful to query on that one. OTA ready, I believe, means that the update has been downloaded and has been prepared. So it's ready for the user to install it. And then OTA installing usually happens when they click the restart button, or if you run ASAP or something and it kicks off the update automatically. Abandon is an interesting one. If it runs into an error, it'll give up and it'll throw an abandoned log line that might have some interesting error codes in there that you can provide back to Apple. But I think at that point, the client is just saying, look, I tried, something came up, let's do this again later when you come back to me. And another example is after the update is applied and the Mac has booted back up, you get this nice report in the unified logs. And you can look for that under the update finished phrase. And what's interesting about this too is you can take the timestamp of this, compare it with the timestamp of maybe the installing, OTA installing, and that gives you an idea of how long the update took for your Mac. And if you are collecting these logs, you can map out how long the updates are taking on all of your Macs, and maybe they're taking longer on some networks than others, and you can go talk to the network team, that sort of thing. Another good filter to look for is this software update notification manager process. These are logs that correspond with the prompts that the user gets when you send down these commands, right? And it'll show information about the user actions, which can be really interesting because you can start to map out how many people are actually hitting restart, how many of them are, furiously closing it out because they don't want to do it. How many of them are just mashing their palms on the keyboard to try to get rid of the thing. You get the user clicked restart line in here, which clearly indicates that they went and did the thing. Or dismiss the notification, which is a very interesting one because if you recall with the later command, they can choose try tonight, they can choose remind me tomorrow. But what do most people do with notifications in Notification Center? They either just click it to get rid of it, or they try to mouse into the little X and click it, or pretty regularly, as soon as they move the mouse, the thing just disappears on its own, right? It tells you what they did. So dismiss the notification, I believe, means they just clicked no, they closed the notification. And of course, for certain commands like install later, that doesn't count as a deferral. So it's kind of a way for, if people figure it out and they're clever enough, they know that they can just indefinitely defer the install later command by just closing the notification or clicking it to open the system settings pane. Another example where this came in handy was there was a bug a few months ago where the clients were just constantly checking for Bootstrap tokens, and then it would cause the cached credential to invalidate itself. And so when the update started applying and the machine rebooted, they would get punted over to the recovery assistant, right? And it would ask you for a password. I think this is what was happening. It was invalidating that cached credential, and then they needed a credential. And so the way that the OS can get that is to ask the user as a volume admin or a volume owner to give them their own password, which it could then use to unlock the disk and update the system volume. And we mapped this out. I mapped this out on my own machine, and I verified when Apple fixed it. So this shows all the Bootstrap token requests that my Mac was doing, and then when I applied that update with the fix, it flatlines, right? So this is really useful because you can use this to verify the fixes. You can go back and close the feedback. How awesome is it when you get to close your own feedback, right? And you can say, yeah, this is great. These errors are not showing up anymore. Okay, we're getting near the end. Everybody's getting a little antsy. You only have to deal with me for a little bit longer, then you can go learn about that DDM and Monkey and everything. So what have we covered? We've talked about MDM commands and responses. And again, it's all documented by Apple. It's kind of a prescriptive protocol. MDM vendors might take that information, build their own workflows around it that are useful for them and for you. And there are some open source tools in the Nano MDM repo that you can use to interact with Apple's documented schema and pull in and maybe even format some commands for yourself to play around with. We looked at the software update command syntax, things like install later, asking the clients for available updates, telling them to scan, that sort of thing. For the schedule commands, they can send different options, including allowing deferrals, doing the forced restart if you really want the update to happen, and that sort of stuff. We talked about how MDM may or may not provide you with a way to inspect those raw responses from the clients. Some of them, again, I think have a nice flow where you can look and it'll show you all of those OS update status responses that I got from the user. It'll probably word it a little bit differently to make it more user-friendly, but that stuff can be useful to know. But if you have some sort of debug mode within your MDM, or if you have access to the logs, it can be useful to look in there. And finally, we talked about how we can utilize what's happening on the clients to figure out what happened when the MDM sent these commands down, and then that can help us create a narrative and tell a story and start to compare expected results versus actual results and go back to Apple with good information. So back to our examples. The kanji example here, again, they do a nice job of kind of abstracting away some of the options, but they tell you there at the top right that you can add a deadline, right? And you can specify the version that should be, specify when the update should be applied. So they're kind of writing in their own deadline logic into this, which kind of hopefully will be taken care of by Apple with the DDM changes that they're making. But this is just an example of a vendor that's taking what Apple gives them and then building some workflows around it to add more flavor for their users. So looking in the logs that was provided, we saw that the MDM sent a scan and it sent a command asking for information about what versions were available. And then it sent down a download. So they're doing the thing where they want to precede the download to make sure it's on disk and cached before they send the update command to maybe make it the process a little bit quicker when they end up doing that. Because if you send the install now command, it might take 20 minutes to download the thing. And I noticed that they sent this a few times. So over a span of 20 minutes, the client got 3 or 4 download only, and then it would ask for a status update about the download, and it got back information saying like, I'm only 80% downloaded, I'm only 90% downloaded, that sort of thing. Then it issued a install action, and they use the default. The documentation states that default is the install ASAP. So you can either specify install ASAP or you can just send default, and that's the one that it'll choose. And they provided both the product key and the product version, which I thought was interesting. I have a feeling that this is not exactly what Apple intends, but it would be worth asking them because you kind of shouldn't need both, right? Because one of them, 13.4.1, is fairly broad. You know, most machines will know what that means. But if there's an RSR, it'll have a different product key, right? So sending just the product key itself should be specific enough for the client to know what you're talking about. But clearly this works to send both. I'm not quite sure which one the client's going to use by default, or if it's even smart enough to say, oh, I see both. It wants this version, but it also wants this key. There's some further logs showing more of what's happening here. The action was initiated by MDM, which is good information to have in the logs. The skip flow is kind of interesting. Does everybody know what flow is? Anyone? I think it stands for first login optimization. Remember on how Intels and Silicon behave differently when you run an update. On an Intel, you still get that countdown that says like 12 minutes available. In Ventura, Apple took the flow part out of Apple Silicon, and that's just it's doing things like updating the Spotlight database and that sort of stuff. But Silicon and SSDs are performant enough now that Apple feels like they don't need to be doing that at that point. So that's why updating Apple Silicon post Ventura is much faster than it was prior to that. But it's right there in the logs. It's telling the system that it wants to skip that. And then throughout, Kanji was sending the occasional OS update status command to the client to ask what's going on. And here it's saying, I'm only at 91%. Through my observation, I think when it gets to above 90%, that means it's actually doing the preparation part. Because when it gets to 90%, it stays there for a long time, right? And it'll stay at a very specific long percentage point here with a decimal. And then after a while, it finally got a response that said, yes, I am 100% complete. And then the user started getting the countdown notification, and they log every single one of those seconds. So you can even look in there and see how long it took somebody to click restart. In this example, he waited till the countdown finished. We got a log line that said the restart is commencing, and then a few minutes later, he got that update finish log with a report that includes some useful information in there. With Jump Cloud, again, the version is written there along with the build number. One thing that's interesting here is it's saying install later today. And so I assume that it's using the install later command. But there's no deferrals. So it'll be curious to see what happens when this command is sent. And so we look in the logs, filtering down on MDM requested, and it shows that, yes, it's sent an install later, and they hard code the deferrals for 1. So the user gets a pop up, and by default, they'll only get 1 deferral. They can say, remind me tomorrow. And then the next day, it's supposed to try and do the thing. This was interesting because Tom helped me with this, and he swears up and down that he clicked try tonight, but the logs say that he dismissed the notification. So can the logs lie to you? Maybe. Who knows? But further down in the logs, Tom was vindicated because it says schedule MDM tonight action. So at some point in the system, it figured out that it was supposed to do the log tonight. And then it went ahead and did the restart, I assume. Actually, I don't know if it ever finished. Do you know? It did? Yep. Excellent. Workspace 1, again, you can choose the download. You can give it the version. I previously thought that was hard-coded in, but it's good to know that they give you the option there. But again, it's interesting. This is for beta 3, but it doesn't say anything about the product key. Maybe that's baked into the product, because why would we need to know, as the admin, you may not want to care what the build is. It says beta 3 right there, so that might be enough for us. We sent down, or he sent down the install later with 3 deferrals. I think actually what happened here is the first command didn't do anything. There was no interaction. And so Workspace ONE has the ability to send a raw command. So I believe what he did is he created the plist itself, uploaded it with the deferral set to 3, sent that down. That made it to the client. It responded. It knows what the product key is. And then a little bit later, we get an error. After it scanned. Oh, the interesting thing here is the bootstrap token. So the clients will verify that the bootstrap token exists, because it needs to use that to unlock the disk during the update overnight, that sort of thing. So that's the whole process where it was invalidating that on accident. And this is how MDMs can kick off an update without user interaction. But there was an error that showed up, something about the commit stash invalid state. I'm guessing this might have been that error where the bootstrap token became invalidated. The OS tried to do an update, and it decided not to because it wouldn't have been able to unlock the disk, but I'm completely guessing at that point. An additional command was sent down to do an install ASAP, I believe. And in the meantime, the response from the client to an OS status update said, nothing's running right now. So it was kind of acknowledging that an error happened and it didn't have anything to do. Then, again, default action is install ASAP, sent down with that product key. And then we saw the downloaded and the ready, meaning it did the download, it did the prepare, and it was getting ready to do the installing. He got the countdown. It went down to 0. The restart notification happened. Sending event, OS installing means it was kicking off the install. And then a few minutes later, of course, he got the update finished after it booted back up. And then simple, again, it gives you the option to choose the relative major OS. You can put a number of deferrals down there with a dropdown. I'm not quite sure how high that goes, but theoretically you could put as many as you want, right? The client got, he sent just the notify only, which is kind of cool. It's actually one of the ones I like to test with because it just gives you the notification. There's no expectations. The user can do it. They may not want to at that time. But he also got an error that no updates were selected, which is a little weird because it told them what update to select. So maybe this was that problem where the client can't see updates and it got confused. Who knows? But a little bit later in the logs, we saw that available updates did change. They did. So maybe it went and scanned and discovered, maybe it was a CDN problem. Maybe it was offline. Who knows? It finally figured out that there was an update available. They sent the MDM initiated skip flow install ASAP down, which is, again, the default action. And the client started the restart countdown. And this one was kind of fun because those were actually in order in the logs. It said starting the restart countdown, and then it said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and just reboot. So there was no countdown. So there are still things to look for in there that might give you an indication of what's happening on your end user machines. Like, has anybody ever had people complain and say, hey, why my Mac just rebooted and started updating? Why are you doing this to me? Why do you hate me? You can look in the logs and figure out exactly what's going on. And that brings us to the end. I want to thank Greg, Mike Boylan, Tom, and Chris for helping me with these screenshots and logs. It was really interesting to go through and look at what the different vendors are doing. And so thank you. We have 20 seconds for questions. Quick. Brown. It won't try again later. You'll need to send that again. Yeah.